Welcome to the Myth-Informed Podcast with Brian and Dimitri. Today is April 30th, 2017, and we have an amazing guest on. His name is Jon Atack. Recently, we've been talking a lot about Scientology. We've had on folks like Ron Miscavige, Antonio Ortega, and this week we have another incredibly unique perspective on this movement. If you follow this topic, you'll love our next guest. If you're not familiar with Scientology, it'll be of interest as we discuss cult practices and propaganda techniques used in other areas of society.
Yeah, thanks, Dimitri. And our guest today, as he said, is Jon Atack. He is an accomplished author and recovering Scientologist. In 1974, he joined Scientology at the age of 19 and spent over 9 years in the organization, eventually reaching OT5. I think the max level is OT7, right? OT8 if you're L Ron Hubbard. He left the church when he became disillusioned with the leadership and influence of David Miscavige. In 1990, he published a book entitled Piece of Blue Sky, and in that book, Jon describes his personal experiences with the church, provides a chronological history of L Ron Hubbard, the Scientology organization and movement, examines the book's Dianetics. His book is really well researched from paper sources and interviews, and it draws conclusions about Scientology as a belief system and critically examines its founder. Jon also has a career as an artist. You can find that at www.jonatack.com, and he often gives lectures on critical thinking. He's gone on to author several more books aimed at understanding the doctrines of Scientology and helping those affected from its collateral damage. Welcome, Jon Atack.
Okay, Jon, so I want to first ask why you've become an ex-Scientologist activist. And, if we took a look at author Russell Miller, there was a famous quote, "It's my first conviction that Jon began to assemble his archive because he has become aware that he had been fed on truths for years, and he simply wanted the truth to be known about the antecedents and antics of his former church and its founder." Would you say that's an accurate statement or any kind of elaboration on the origin story of you coming to Scientology?
Yeah, it's fair enough. I was 19 years old. I had a tragically unhappy romance, and that propelled me into Scientology. The people I met there I went to the Birmingham Mission in England, and they were really charming, delightful people. They were a couple of years older than I was. They were university graduates in a variety of subjects. And I was love bombed. I was charmed into it. They sincerely believed in everything. I mean, one of the great difficulties with the modern totalist cult groups of Scientology type is that nearly everybody involved in them really genuinely believes. It's only at the very top that there's any awareness of the scam of what's going on. So people really think that they're going to, you come to Scientology and they'll, I wasn't initially in the least bit interested in, achieving superhuman powers, which is one of the ridiculous claims that they make. But this idea of having, complete emotional equanimity, being in a condition where it wouldn't, nothing would bother me. I'd have a kind of serene disposition. Sadly, it didn't happen. In 9 years, in fact, my disposition probably got worse because you tend to be less compassionate, less considerate, more narcissistic, which I think is the problem with just about anything that we call a cult group, and why we call it a cult group, because it'll tend to have a narcissistic leader, and you will then clone yourself upon that leader. You will pick up the traits of the leader, so becoming, self-obsessed as you go along. So I did 9 years of it. I was very lucky because I was never working for Scientology. I was never, as they say, on staff, and was pretty much treated as a celebrity, which was kind of strange as I had absolutely no money. But because I was an artist, because I was a writer, they treated me more gently than they did other people. So I was never humiliated and abused. Unlike almost everybody of the, more than 1,000 members and ex-members that I've met, I didn't come away traumatized. So I was able to put my name out in public and say where I was, which made me quite unusual in in the terms of the history of Scientology, because Scientology is notorious for harassing its critics. So, people would tend to, say, I'm a critic of Scientology. I'm not going to tell you who I am, and here's a post office box you can write to, which is not very useful, really. So I for a dozen years, I helped former members. I mean, when I left, I still believed. I believed in Hubbard. I believed in Scientology. I just wasn't willing to stop communicating with one of my friends. I'd been ordered to disconnect from this friend, and I said, I'm not going to do it. And 6 months later, when I'd been everywhere you're meant to go and done all of the proper things on channels, as they call it, and received no satisfactory response about why this friend of mine had been declared a suppressive person and ostracized, I left. But I left intending to sort of take Scientology out of the Church of Scientology and make it more accessible, less expensive. I mean, by then we were already paying about £200 an hour. So what's about $250 an hour to sit with somebody who might well only have been trained for a few weeks, so this money could go into Hubbard's vast pockets. It's worth saying that when he died, he had $648 million in the bank. And that's what he managed not to spend. During those last years, his own crew, the Sea Organization, who were Sea as in SEA, body of water, they were actually denied toilet paper by him. They had to, you hear these stories of them going and raiding telephone boxes to get the
yellow pages.
Yeah.
Wow.
Run your fingers through that. No.
It's a nice visual.
Sorry about that. This awful situation where this man had, he had 2,000 camera pieces. He had a 24-track recording studio. He had a full-size racetrack on his property with Aberdeen Angus bulls and black swans. While the people who worked for him were getting maybe $5 a week, working a 90-hour week, at which point you say there's probably something wrong here. This probably isn't actually advancing us to a superhuman state. It's just a form of psychological slavery.
Mm-hmm. Well, the origins of you getting into the religion or this belief system, I mean, you talked about that catalyst of the fact that you were in a relationship and it was, she ran off with one of your really good friends. So would you say that that's a common catalyst for folks to launch into a new religion? Because you were a practicing Buddhist at the time, is that correct? And then
that is correct.
You had this
in
whole
the Soto Zen sect.
Yeah, you had a whole shifting in the journey of your belief. So it's interesting why Buddhism didn't do it for you in order to cope with this, and then you found such an answer in Scientology, which ended up being a cult.
Yeah, I found a group of people who were friendly and kept telling me that they had the solution to whatever my problem was. That solution never came about. The question of my upset over that relationship was never once addressed in Scientology. They have their own program, and you're on the conveyor belt, and you go through the stages that they want. Let me say though, because I've spent the last 30-something years studying cults in general and totalitarian systems in general, that the first step is usually one of dislocation. So it can often be that you've lost a relationship, but it can also be that you've moved away from where you're used to living. There are particular times when people are more vulnerable, in their late teens, in adolescence, and then again in their 60s. People are psychologically more vulnerable. So you may have lost a relationship, but you may have lost a job. It can also be, and I met others who simply really, really wanted to help people and were sold on the idea that this was a workable therapeutic system, and they joined for that reason. But it's usually something of your routine, something of the habits of your life has changed, and you become open to new ideas at that point.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And any time that you've suffered a trauma, a loss in the family, heck, I've got my midlife crisis coming up, right? So, I mean, that could potentially it's a good thing we're doing this now.
Mm-hmm. Right. But then you turn to something that you know, that surprises me. I mean, if maybe it's because Buddhism isn't such a it's less of a religion and more of maybe a way of life or a belief system. And I don't know if it's less organized, where you couldn't go to folks who were believing the same thing you were. You couldn't go to a yoga class or something, and that helped you deal with your grief. It's this kind of therapeutical belief system that sucked you in at the end.
Or is it just the people, like that you have an Insta community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is a sense of community. And to clarify, the two Zen teachers I knew were each of them more than 200 miles away from me. I had no telephone contact with them. And frankly, I'd had my concerns about the Buddhist practice as well. And if you look to Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control, the new edition of it, he actually has a section on exactly the sect I belong to.
Okay.
And I agree that the guy who was actually later the president of that group is Steve's informant, saying it turned into a controlling cult group. And that's certainly true of some of the Tibetan sects. If you look at Chogyam Trungpa, who was Purna Chodron's teacher, he's been, accused of all sorts of terrible sexual misbehavior. The staff at Naropa University in Colorado, a Tibetan Buddhist establishment, a number of them, so I'm told, have suffered from AIDS because they practiced Tantra with, and I thoroughly and utterly, by the way, disagree with Tantra and the idea that you can approach Buddhist enlightenment through sexuality or through sexual behavior. It's crazy. I don't think the Buddha would have liked it. But wherever you go...
It's a very enticing belief system.
Well, it is until you start finding out that Tantra is practiced traditionally with prostitutes. It's not a loving thing, and it's practiced for the benefit of, achieving magical powers. So it's actually, we only have one great advocate of it, which, of course, is Sting, the musician.
Really? John, we are learning so much today. This is fascinating.
There you go. It's fantastic, isn't it?
So, go on.
So I didn't have a community, and in fact, I was very distressed. So I knew a psychiatrist who was a friend of mine, and so I phoned her up and said, "Well, I can't do anything about it, because you're not my patient." And it was like, okay. So I phoned my doctor, and my doctor said, "Oh, I can't do anything about it." And I phoned a clergyman when I'd first heard about Scientology to say, is this a safe thing to do? So I did the right things to check, and help wasn't really available. The clergyman, and this is crazy because 3 years before there'd been a mind-boggling government report on Scientology in Britain, which absolutely condemned it out of Hubbard's mouth. They just used Hubbard quotations to show how evil this system is, how destructive it is towards opponents particularly.
But this was 74. I mean, you didn't have the internet back then, so there's no, if you were trying to get into it now, you'd Google it, you'd find Jon Atack telling you, well, not a good idea.
Find South Park telling you about Tom Cruise staying in the closet, frankly, which I think, had more to do with slowing them down than anything else, because, if you are in that vulnerable age in adolescence and you go to your friends and say, "Hey, I've heard about this great L Ron Hubbard thing," they'll say, "Yeah, go and watch South Park."
You're out of your mind, yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And we'll all laugh at you if you join it.
As they bring you in, I mean, in your talks, you mentioned of some very clever Scientology terms, which, you call thought-terminating cliches. So they do a lot with changing and rearranging the language. Mm-hmm. Like, how quickly did they do that? Does that start in on your early levels? I mean...
It's instant.
Okay.
The first day I became involved, I was told two things. I was told that misunderstood words are the only barrier to study and why people don't understand things. So I was told that. And then I was told that I had to do a drill called Operating Thetan Training Routine 0. And so on the one hand, I'm being told this is really, a bad thing to do. And on the other hand, I'm immediately being given this incredibly complex notion, the operating thetan, thetan being there, Hubbard's word for the spirit or self, and operating meaning a thetan who is able to leave his or her physical body and travel around at will. Sadly, as yet, I've not met anybody who can do this, and they could claim $1 million from James Randi if they could just do it. You know, but
I think that offer's still out there. It is. No, you mentioned things like phrases like "make it go right," "the out is the way through." What would Ron do? Upstat, downstat. What are these? I mean, could you break down a few of these specific examples?
Well, upstat and downstat, that's an up statistic or a down statistic, basically meaning you're a good person supporting Scientology, an upstat, or a bad person who is not doing enough for Scientology, a downstat. The complexity is astonishing. If you look at ideas about psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists, whatever we want to call them, one of the things that's said is that these people actually have strange verbal habits, and they tend to make up words. They tend to get words wrong and make them up. Now, L Ron Hubbard left 2 500-page dictionaries of his new terms. You know, he may have put more words into the language than Shakespeare did in the end. Thankfully, however, Shakespeare's stuff has stuck, and I don't think that, DevT or randomity, or he also turned words around. So, I'm very happy to represent a group called the Open Minds Foundation. And there's something personal for me in it, because Hubbard said, you can't be open-minded about Scientology. You've got to have a closed mind. You mustn't, think about it. Just believe what I tell you, basically. So, but he also picked up the word reasonable, and he made that a negative term. If you accuse a Scientologist of being reasonable, that's an offensive, that's an insult to them. So you get into this thing with many ex-Scientologists, the language is so dense that they're just incomprehensible to non-Scientologists, or WOGs, as Hubbard called non-Scientologists, which in Britain is an extraordinarily rude word, very much like the N-word.
Yeah.
But Hubbard came over here and heard this word that was used for non-Caucasian people, picked it up and said, non-Scientologists are WOGs. He also called non-Scientologists raw meat, and he also said non-Scientologists are dead in the head. So you can be a dead in the head raw meat WOG, basically.
Wow.
And that's the contemptuous view that Hubbard had of anybody who didn't adulate him.
That is definitely, I think that qualifies as narcissism. Absolutely.
It qualifies as brainwashing.
Well,
Wow.
he was a super narcissist. At one point, he said that in 50,000 years, his were the only developments in the field of the mind and spirit in 50,000 years, which of course makes you go, well, what was the one 50,000 years ago,
Right. Yeah, before writing.
Somebody using the word ugh for the first time, or, I don't really know.
Grunting. I don't get it. It's interesting on changing the words, though. Were some other words, obviously reasonably, were other words changed? And I mentioned, like, you can get an Orwellian piece where if you've changed all the words, you can't criticize. If every word for criticism is changed to something good, then I simply can't criticize anything because the language is missing.
Well, yeah. But that's a verbal component, and that surprises me because, John, you talk about these horror stories where folks are getting paid $5. They're $5 a week. They're locked up in closets or wherever. They're basically being mistreated. Doesn't matter what kind of language you use. How are folks staying in it? It can't be that the language is impacting you and tricking you so much that you don't know what's physically happening to you.
Well, we do tend to think in language. Most of our conceptual thought is linguistic. It's based in language. So our feelings, our emotions are, fundamental, but we describe them to ourselves in words, and language becomes loaded so that there are many, using the word cult, for example, if I use the word cult to somebody who's in one, they'll get very angry. If I point out that the word in the dictionary simply means somebody who follows, is dedicated to a particular leader, and that's all it means, then they have nothing to be upset about, but they'll still be upset. People who study words talk about purr and snarl words. So the word fascist is a snarl word, and the word democracy is a purr word in our culture. Though, of course, if you'd been in Germany or Italy in the 1930s, it worked the other way around.
Right.
So you get whole cultural constructions, and we accept all sorts of things without really thinking about it. So, you may, for example, eat cheese. You were talking about rolling it earlier on, before we went on air, obviously. Because we don't want people to know.
That's going to be weird out of context, too.
Exactly. With your private life, it's up to you. But if you don't offer, no, I'm not making any criticism of your cheese habits. If you offer a piece of cheese to somebody who's grown up in rural China, they'll be disgusted, because this is, firstly, it's stuff that's come out of an animal.
Yeah.
It's somebody's milked an animal to make this, and then what have they done? They've let it go rotten.
Yep.
And now you've got cheese, which you can roll and do what you want with. On the other hand, we don't tend to eat spiders, bumblebees,
Crickets.
Well, crickets are. You see, I was going to say that. That was the next one I was going to say, and then I suddenly thought, but people in the US, people do eat crickets.
Yeah, crickets have become
cricket burgers, can't you?
Yeah,
crunchy cricket burgers. But we don't tend to eat insects. But about 2/3 of the world, people do. So a lot of that's the culture. It's what you're brought up in. And what happens if you join another culture? You want to take on that culture. Yeah. So actually, when people get into Scientology, they want to learn the words, because the words have this kind of magical invocation quality to them, that if you can talk in this language about having engrams and secondaries and locks in your reactive mind, which are blocking your analytical mind, you can feel you know something.
You did just say a lot by saying nothing.
Yeah, and round you go. That thing of putting a label on something, is why do birds fly south in the winter? Oh, well, it's because of instinct. Well, you don't know any more than you did when you asked the question, but you've got a word now, instinct. Mm-hmm. And I think we conceal our ignorance, and I think our school system encourages this by getting people to memorize facts rather than understand processes.
So how much was dogmatic? Like, you probably couldn't say, should we be practicing Scientology versus, say, Buddhism or something else? But you might be able to say, are we practicing Scientology in the right way? I mean, at what point, how much flexibility did you have, and what would you get told depending on your question?
Well, there is no flexibility. Hubbard actually put forward the notion that he had created a technology of the mind, and it is forbidden to talk about the ideas or the procedures. That's called verbal technology if you do that. You're also forbidden from talking about your own problems, which is called your case. And you're told that communication is the universal solvent and the thing we all need to learn how to do. You're also told who you can and can't communicate with. So there's a lot of stuff you can't say. You can't talk about your own problems. You can't talk about Scientology or how it works or might not work. You're put into a straitjacket. And indeed, every Scientology course begins with a policy letter called Keeping Scientology Working, which tells you that you must hammer out of existence any other form of technology. You are not allowed to mix practices. So you cannot do yoga or meditate or anything at all that is not allowed by Scientology, and nothing is allowed.
And you must be a fundamentalist then. There's no words for innovations like this. In Islam, they might call it shirk. This is an innovation.
Yes. There's a demand for purity in Robert J. Lifton's brilliant thought reform model. To become pure, you must use their language. You must believe utterly, and it becomes a sort of, in the same way that status seeking is done by having a bigger car or a faster car or a prettier car or what have you. Status in Scientology is to do with what levels you've done, what courses you've done, so you can brag about that. Many years ago, over 20 years ago, I stopped doing any kind of exit counselling. And I hasten to add that I was never involved in deprogramming of any kind. I was never involved in kidnapping anybody, and I was always outspoken against people who do that, and I still am. But nonetheless, in exit counselling, all I had to do was sit down with a Scientologist and say, I'm OT5. And they were listening.
Okay, so that was street cred.
Super high level, you know?
Okay. At what point do you get the street cred? I mean, is it OT5 or is OT3 enough?
So I think it's become much more difficult for people to get onto those levels. As I say, I didn't really have any money, but I still managed to do OT levels. Nowadays, you're talking about probably $500,000 to get to the level I got to.
Wow.
So anything over the state of clear, any of the OT levels is viewed as something special. I had a bizarre experience 20 years ago. I was in Chicago filming for a documentary, and the documentary crew said, "Oh, go and stand outside the Chicago org for us with a microphone on and, say something. It'll just be a good bit of B-roll, And so I was, I wasn't totally sure about this. And I went and stood, in front of all of these book dumps of Dianetics with volcanoes on. And I'm stood there saying something rude about this. And this little voice, this charming little voice, comes to me from inside the organization. Would you like to come inside? And just as I was walking in, these two guys came running out. These two burly guys came running out. I didn't quite realize what was happening, but I walked into the organization and the woman said, do you know anything about Scientology? And I said, yeah, I'm OT5. And she called out. She said, hey, we've got a guy here. He's OT5. So people started, flocking into the reception. It was so unusual, apparently, for them to see, the revered OT5. And she said, when are you going to Florida to do OT6? And I said, never. And there was a slight pause. I said, because it's all nonsense. They just tell you dead little spirits. Now, the two guys who'd gone running out were their security guys, and they were chasing the camera crew down the street because they'd seen the tripod. So they didn't know what to do. They were just paralyzed. They didn't know what to do with me. I was obviously utterly evil, and probably, I could have destroyed them all with a glance. So they were stuck there. So, the OT stuff can be useful, but only with Scientologists, unfortunately.
Well, you talk about the fact that ex-Scientologists are more arrogant than apostates of other religions. Is it because of that, or does it depend on the level that you reached when you left the organization? Because you clearly, in that instance, commanded a lot of authority.
Yeah, briefly.
It seems curious. So why is that? Why are they more arrogant than, say, an ex-Muslim or an ex-Mormon?
Well, firstly, let me put that into context. I repeated a cult expert who's a very close friend of mine who has never been involved in Scientology, my friend Christian Jericho. He said to me quietly once that the ex-Scientologist, and this is a guy who has worked with perhaps 3,000 ex-cult members in the last 40 years. And he's met people from hundreds of different groups. And he said there's just this thing about ex-Scientologists so frequently that they think they know it all. They really think that they are an elite. To be fair, that's true of pretty much any cult group, though. That they each group feels that they have privileged information that, puts them above the rest of us. You can also find this in political parties, and I'm not going to mention any names at this point. You can fill it in for yourself. But there are some incredibly narcissistic people involved with politics, involved with law, involved with really any of the professions. You'll find, Robert Hare writing about psychopath, he says that in the general population, he'd expect to find about one person in 100 who was a psychopath. Whereas once you move into politics and corporate finance and what have you, the numbers go up. He says about 3.5%. So in cult groups, because you have this cloning process, there was a guy, he came to be the head of the American Society for Personality Studies, called Flavel Yakeley, and he was asked to do a study of the Boston Church of Christ. Kip McKean's, well, I think they threw Kip McKean out in the end, but Kip was still running it then. And Kip was affronted because somebody had suggested that he was running a cult group. And so he wanted Flavel Yakeley to prove that this wasn't true, and he gave him access to 900 members.
Wow.
And he did personality profiles, and he said, how were you 5 years ago? How are you now? How do you want to be in 5 years' time? And he was horrified because this was still back in the 80s when it was believed that personality is fixed from birth. We now know that that's not true, that personality can alter very significantly through the course of a lifetime. But what he found was that all 900 members had pretty much the same personality.
It was like a hive mind.
Yeah, it's kind of the Borg, in Star Trek.
Yeah,
exactly. And what they wanted to be in 5 years was identical. He then went off and studied other groups, smaller numbers, Scientology among them. And he found that each group, so-called cult group, had its own particular personality profile. But when he profiled mainstream Christian congregations, he found all 16 of the different personality types in each congregation. So he came up with this notion of cloning and said, each group has its own ideal human form, and people move towards that form. Sadly, that ideal form is narcissistic, arrogant, bullying, selfish, not really the kind of saintly people we would like in the world.
When it comes to confrontation, so you had this example where you walked in and you talked to a group and you were basically very forthright with them about what you believed about OT6 and the entire institution. You also talk about cognitive dissonance as it relates to Scientology, how you speak to them, that the more overbearing, the more, ardent you are in the fact that what they believe is BS, the more they're going to shut down. So you advocate in some of your other talks to a more subtle approach of talking to people, and I think it's fascinating because it goes beyond just Scientology. It can relate to describing your politics or talking to other religious folks. So can you talk to us about some of these techniques that you find to be successful in talking to a believer of really any faith?
Well, it's not even so much a technique as a matter of respect. That if you, as you say, with cognitive dissonance, I mean, my study for the last 25, 30 years, I've studied terrorism in significant detail and profiled terrorists, because the dynamics of a human being, the psychology of human beings is the same in every culture, wherever you go in the world. There are influences upon us, but cognitive dissonance is something that we all experience. If somebody comes to me and seeks to disprove my beliefs, then hopefully I'm willing to hear them out and consider what they say. But the normal emotional response is to reject them. We have what's called confirmation bias, where we accept information that supports our point of view. But, no matter how good the evidence, there was a study, there's an Italian team who've been working on this, and there was a piece in this month's Scientific American about their research into, I think it was 55 million postings on the internet, because they can, they've got computers, so they can go through an enormous amount of data. And they'd studied, on the one hand, Facebook sites held by people of scientific belief who were, looking at rational explanations of things, and conspiracy theorists. And they found that with the conspiracy theorists, that where they offered them material that absolutely would refute and rebut what they believed, it made them more likely to visit other conspiracy sites. About 30% of people, it stimulated them to believe more strongly in the nonsense they believed in. You have to be aware of that. So in talking with somebody who is a true believer, an ardent believer, you have to respect their right to believe. You have to establish, who you are and why they should talk to you first, but show respect for them. And that is fundamental. Not, your communication needs to be polite and considerate. will occasionally find that a little bit of emotional upset goes somewhere, but it's generally best to leave that to members of their own family rather than trying to do it deliberately. And get the person to open up, get them to tell you why they believe what they believe, how they came to believe what they believe. For me, you can ask somebody, what interested you in in the first place? What did you hope to achieve? What have you achieved? What do you hope to achieve in the future? What have you seen other people achieve? And often in just talking about that, so not arguing with the person, not seeking to show them conflicting information to what they believe, but letting them express themselves. And often they will walk into it for themselves as they're telling you, well, I expected I'd be able to fly within 3 weeks of getting involved. And they kind of go, and it didn't happen, that I haven't got there. The significant thing, I'm involved with the Open Minds Foundation all the time, 7 days a week for the last couple of years. And our idea is to be a preventative. We're not here to do anything about cult groups directly. If we can help people to recover a little, then that's fantastic. But absolutely our essential mission is to teach people about such things as confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. I think every school child should understand these things. Working with my friend Ira Chalef, who published a book called Intelligent Disobedience. And he 20 years or more ago, developed what's called courageous followership, this idea that we can do something about dangerous leaders. We can be better followers. We don't just have to fall into the groupthink and, slaver over how wonderful they are. We can actually find ways of communicating with leaders and change things. And he was giving a seminar one day, and he started talking about this concept of teaching people to disobey. And a woman in the seminar said, yeah, I've got an example of that under the desk. And everybody in the room looked round, and out came this guide dog. And she was training a guide dog. She said a guide dog has to be able to disobey its master or mistress. Say it's a blind person, they're about to walk into something. The dog has to be able to say, no, I'm not going to do what you want. And it's called intelligent disobedience among trainers. And Ira went off and wrote this fantastic book, Intelligent Disobedience, which has a foreword by the great psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who's pretty much saying, I spent my life trying to work out what this guy has discovered. If we could just teach children to say, no, I think that's wrong, and this is why I think it's wrong, then that's a being allowed to assert themselves, rather than our education system, which looks to make children obedient. Mm-hmm. As if disobedience was a bad thing, as if thinking differently was wrong,
I wonder, would that make sense that people talk about a political bubble these days, and there's probably many. I mean, if you read that, is it applicable to something like a political bubble if someone is not religious? I mean, for reading purposes.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is not at all with religion. It's with belief. Richard Dawkins, about 10 years ago, did a TV series which he opened by saying, if it wasn't for religion, there wouldn't be suicide bombing. Now, at that time, there had actually been just over 900 recorded suicide bombings. Half of them were secular. Mm-hmm. Half of them had nothing to do with religious belief. So any fervent belief, and any fanatical belief, any entrenched belief, any unwillingness to hear other people's opinions. I mean, I'm a big fan of John Stuart Mill and his book on liberty, which was published in the 1850s. And in it, he explains why we have to listen to even when we believe we know all of the arguments, even when we are sure that the person espousing the argument is an idiot, we still need to listen, because otherwise we become entrenched in our beliefs. We become overly righteous about our own beliefs. We lose humility, and we will then use the full weight of our intelligence to buttress our stupidity, which is something we see plenty of in this world, I'm afraid. So, politics, within justice systems, therapy, the amount of devastatingly destructive psychotherapy that's going on out there, doled out by narcissistic therapists who basically just, they want people to follow them. They want people to adopt their worldview, which is always the sign of a narcissist, that their whole sense of self-esteem depends on other people adulating them.
That's interesting. So this is outside of first I thought you were talking about Scientology, but here you're talking about other maybe self-help guides or self-help strategies. Could be narcissistic therapy.
Yeah, well, look at all of the new thought movements. I mean, The Secret and the Law of Attraction. This is Christian Science came out of it. That there have been so many of these things. And when you look at the individuals who started them, like Mary Baker Eddy, for example, you find out that they're corrupt. You find out that they're deluded, and you find out that they're incredibly narcissistic. So what they've done is they've set up this thing saying all you've got to do is wish, and the reason you're not getting a perfect life is because you're not wishing properly. In Scientology, it's called postulating. And so anything that goes wrong in your life is your fault, and anything that goes right, the guru owns. It's because of this system. And I can't get my head around it now. I can't believe that, as a young man in my 20s, I believed in, the notion of karma, which Scientology has in its own version, its own clumsy language, the overt motivator sequence. This idea that the universe is somehow rigged so that 417 people can all get on an aeroplane on the same day and die in a crash because it was karmically the right moment. When you get into the Hindu origins of this thought, you find that you've got the lords of karma. And they keep these things called the Akashic records, so that everything that every living being does is recorded in the Akashic records. So every ant in every ant's nest, every one of the 2 billion eggs that is laid by a giant clam, all of this is recorded. And you come into this, it's just impossible. It's like Laplace's demon, the idea that if you knew where every atom in the universe was for a single moment, you could predict everything that would happen afterwards.
Right.
But the problem is you need a computer larger than the universe to determine where everything was.
Right. Not even deep thought could do that.
Not even deep thought. And
From Douglas Adams fame.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we've got to have a religion, then Douglas Adams should be at the center of it. Because,
It took you 1,000,000 years, and all you could come up with is 42.
42?
Yeah.
So, do you think that part of this, it's interesting how the God concept, like God can do no wrong, like any miracle that saves a baby from getting hit by a bus is God's miracle. Any kid dying of leukemia at 3 is not. But you can see that also translated to politics. You can have a hyper-nationalist that says this country can do no wrong, and the postmodernist that only says the country can do bad, that they won't give the country any credit for anything good it's done.
Postmodernism is one of the most savage cults of our time. It's gone all the way through academia. This idea that any opinion is as good as any other,
right?
Which is just childishly ridiculous. The idea that my ideas about relativity are just as good as Einstein's. I'm sorry to say it's not true.
I know. I've been examining that, and I'm not ready to call that cult-like thinking, but certain groups may practice that. But in itself, I see some parallels, changing the definition of racism, for example.
But that's weird. I mean, that's open-mindedness. So that's basically saying being too open-minded is a cult, and that it's a full circle then.
I don't think it's being open-minded. I think it's being closed-minded if you've taken in a dogmatic belief by which you judge the universe. To be open-minded means to be open-minded to different systems and different approaches. To follow Derrida or any of the deconstructionists, to me, it's a cult, plain and simple, that you sit down and read a page of this stuff and go, oh, come on, grow up. It's not like reading kind of Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or somebody who's had a bit of a think about it. You're reading a self-defeating set of ideas, which by trying to seek a kind of absolute communism of thought where everybody is absolutely equal, we have to forego logic. We have to forego reasoning. Mm-hmm. So it's cultish. But I think, that notion of what a cult is, as I say, it's an authoritarian leader. So once you've said, oh, this person is completely right about the universe and I do what they say, then you've joined a cult. My thought is that we should all of us develop our own sovereignty, not to become sovereign citizens. I don't want to go down that route and, get a shotgun and shoot anybody that comes into my garden. But the idea of personal sovereignty, my thinking is as independent as possible, that people should be absolutely encouraged to disagree, to politely, agreeably, but to think about things and go, well, no, that doesn't make sense to me, or that doesn't fit in with the way I feel. The other end of that, you have the cult, which is where, look at what's happening in religion in the last decade or so. The Catholic Church, and, what was it? There were 500 priests listed as abusers by the Australian Royal Commission. 500. We've had similar, scandals in the cult groups. The Jehovah's Witnesses, I'm told, keep a list of 23,000 people who have committed sexual abuse, which on religious grounds they refuse to release to the police, which is a horrific criminal conspiracy as far as I'm concerned. Not revealing the names of people who have abused children is just wrong. But the Catholic Church did that systematically. We now have an inquiry into the Anglican Church in this country, who ran children's homes, which were used as, virtual child brothels. I've interviewed somebody whose childhood was destroyed in this way in an Anglican orphanage. Then you look to the Methodists. They have a scandal. So we have these organizations, they come together and they then have this thing that the great truth of our organization is more important than what we do. So where there is abuse, it's permissible for us to conceal it so that people don't get the wrong idea about our organization. You're going, no, that would be the right idea about your organization.
Well, and this is an ongoing argument, right? So it has to do with the police as well. So if you point out cases of abuse, someone will say, well, that's a bad apple. That doesn't represent the whole bunch or whatever it is. But then you make the argument that you need certain transparencies, you need reform within the inside. And if the department, or in this case, the religious organization, isn't willing to make proper internal reforms, then you have a problem with the whole institution then.
Yes, and I think we've seen that. The Catholic Church has suffered massively in the last decade, particularly in Western Europe. So in Ireland, where, and it wasn't just that. I mean, you've got the Magdalene homes, which were running into the 1990s, where women who were unmarried women were forced into virtual slave labor, and their children taken away from them and sold, to wealthy Americans.
Adopted out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, a similar scandal happened with the export of children from Britain to Australia in the 1950s, which has finally been exposed. There is institutional, craziness, and the police are involved, the judiciary involved. One of our members of Parliament, Cyril Smith, after his death, it was discovered that he'd been preying on children in 2 orphanages. Of course, Jimmy Savile is our world famous case, with over 500 individuals abused by him between the ages of 2 and 90. He was the most awful sexual predator, yet he had the ear of the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and he had a key to Broadmoor, our psychiatric institution. He could go into any room in Broadmoor, any time of the night or day, and he had the support of government ministers in what he was doing. He also had the support of the West Yorkshire Police, who received many complaints about him and said, oh, no, it's Jimmy, he wouldn't do that. So I think this is causing a shift in culture, but it's to say that, in mainstream culture, there are cultic practices, the most abhorrent of which is to do with the abuse of children. And that we need to change our system. We need to be more transparent. That word that politicians have been giving us for the last 25 years, transparent, which I think they have a slightly different meaning to being able to see through something. I think they mean obscurantist or, this kind of stuff. I mean, again, in politics, we've seen this incredible thing that the spin doctors, who only started to dominate politics in the 1970s, are so narcissistic that they all had to go and give interviews and write books about how they were tricking us. So nobody trusts politicians anymore because the politicians trusted the spin doctors.
That's incredible. It seems like, too, when a system is getting exposed or people don't want light to be shed on this, they try to block it. For example, in your book, in 1990, A Piece of Blue Sky was initially blocked in the courts. You had to win on appeal just to publish it. And then when published, your house got picketed and flyers distributed around your home saying probably very bad things about you. I mean, is that kind of what happened to you?
Well, and this is a big deal. This is the only book in U.S. history ever to be restrained prior to publication.
Right.
There's one other book that was restrained before it, but that was about the CIA. That was Victor Marchetti's book about the CIA. And that was restrained because it revealed things that genuinely did affect national security. I was incredibly lucky because I had the same lawyer as Victor Marchetti, Mel Wolfe, who is just brilliant. He went into court and there were 18 distinct rulings made by the judge. And yes, he ordered prior restraint. So from, the signing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights through to now, only one book has ever been restrained in the United States that did not touch on issues of national security. And that is, let's sell these people a piece of blue sky. How Scientology was able to achieve that, I'm not quite sure. It could have been that the judge really was genuinely ignorant.
John, it's a very distinctive honor, though. I think you should carry that as a badge.
Well, I have lots of these badges, but sadly they do leave scars. I have 10 precedents in law. I have 9 in England, and they're all unpleasant. I was, for example, charged as a witness. I was charged the costs of a hearing because Scientology wanted me to do a deposition for a California case. And I pointed out to the judge that under English law, you cannot order a deposition unless a person has refused to attend court in the foreign country. I'd not even been asked to attend. And the thought of, Scientology flying me out to California and putting me up in a 4-star hotel so that I could testify against them was quite charming. They wanted to do a deposition because they wanted to harass me. And I did end up having to do the deposition, even though this was a precedent. The first time that somebody had been ordered to do a deposition who was perfectly willing to travel to the foreign country.
Well, and their reach is massive. I mean, we recently started representing Ron Miscavige and recreating his online persona, web page, his social media presence, and it's just been devastated by the Scientology organization. So we know kind of now, maybe not firsthand.
Scientologists, don't get yourself into a liable situation here. Mm-hmm. I mean that, having been sued by them, I don't know how many times. If you say Scientologists, then you are not necessarily talking about the organization, because one of the horrific aspects of Scientology is they have these things called the ethics conditions. And the idea is that you can be assigned a condition of liability by Scientology, and you then have to perform a damaging act against somebody who's opposed to Scientology. So they function as free agents. My house was broken into a couple of times. Nothing was taken. It was just made clear that they could get into my house.
Sure.
This was probably by random Scientologists. It may well, the organization may have known nothing about it. Mm-hmm. It's a culture of destruction and evil.
Wow. Did they ransack it or just leave a note saying?
Left a window open. I had things stolen at other times. One day I was woken up by somebody opening my front door, and I went downstairs, and it was my next door neighbor. And he looked around at the guy behind him. He said, oh, this guy said he'd got to get into your house. And it's like, I've never. And the guy was going, and running away, So
that could be more disconcerting, because if, they're going, we're going to beat you up. At least it's going to go, I thought they were going to kill me. Mm-hmm. But when you don't know their intentions, that I think that forces you to fret about them.
Well, the thing is to destroy your relationships with other people. There's an 800-page training manual that was used by the Guardian's office, and that landed 11 of them in jail in the US. There were convictions in Canada. There were convictions in France. They had infiltrated government agencies all over the world following this 800-page training manual. Now, they then busted the publicly known members of the Guardian's office in an attempt to pretend that they cleaned their act up. They actually kept all of the intelligence department functioning, with the exception of the head of it, Mo Budlong, who was sent to prison. But there was still, all of the people who'd been committing these criminal acts on their behalf remained in their employ for years afterwards. I mean, in 1991, so 10 years after the reform of the Guardian's office, Peter Stumkey, who had run harassment in the UK, was still running harassment in the UK. This 800-page pack in 1990 was reissued within the organisation, but it was modified. It was modified. The cover sheet no longer said Guardian's Office; it said Office of Special Affairs. The remaining 800 pages were identical. And they have material on breaking and entering. They have material on how to lie effectively. Basically, it's material about how to harass people and, make them shudder into silence if they dare criticize Scientology. They're a lot less effective now than they were, when back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. People did die as a consequence of the trauma that was inflicted upon them by Scientology.
Well, and back to your book, I mean, the original copy you report was stolen. So do you have suspicions that it was certain people in a certain organization?
How could you suggest such a thing? I know exactly who took it. It was a man called Douglas Bryan Reynolds, who was
that's pretty exact.
We later worked out that he worked for a man called John Ingram. Curiously, they like this name Ingram. They had Eugene Ingram working for them in the US and John in the UK. No relation, we're told. But we tracked him and who he worked for and what he was doing. He was a private detective for about 6 months. He was visiting me. He'd bring me bottles of Perrier-Jouet champagne and or port or, nice things.
Mm-hmm.
He'd arrive in a Rolls Royce, which had his initials on the number plate, which was in fact a complete coincidence. We traced to the rental company eventually and found that out. But he seemed like, a disillusioned young man who claimed he wanted to do something good in the world. And by that time I'd approached 50 publishers. 11 of them had told me they'd love to publish my book, but it would be a very stupid mistake on their part to do it because they would lose money in the ensuing litigation. So, I mean, Collins, who were then the biggest publisher in the world, they had the book at editorial committee for 6 months with one of their publishers saying, look, this is a great book. We really need to do this. And the rest of them going, yeah. And why? The book needs to be published and the information needs to be out there, but we're a business,
Yeah.
And, we're not going to do anything about that. So I'd come to the point where I'd given my book to Russell Miller so that he could use the material as the basis for his excellent Barefaced Messiah. And this guy came along and said, look, I'll give you money to take the manuscript and I will publish it. And I wasn't completely sure about this guy, but after a few weeks, he wore me down and let him have a copy of the manuscript. So it stolen might be too strong a word. It worked out well for us in the end because there was this crazy thing in the US then caused by the author J.D. Salinger, who somebody had published a biography of him and they'd quoted from over 70 of his letters. These letters were in a public university collection. Anybody could go and see them, but Salinger's lawyers pointed out that he could publish them and make money from them. So therefore, they should not be published by anybody else. And there were cases for the Stravinsky estate, the Hemingway estate. Then Russell Miller's book was hit under this same thing. because I'd had access to Hubbard diaries, Hubbard's private letters, and I'd let Miller have these things, and he'd quoted from them, and his book was pretty much stopped. There was no prior restraint in his case, but the judge explained that he could publish, but there was a suit there for the use of unpublished copyright material. And because we knew this by the time, that was 88, in 1989, when my book was coming out, we knew this. So I'd had to take out all 60 of the juicy quotes that came from this unpublished material. I'm happy to say that the new edition, which is called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, my book is still being sold by a pirate publisher in its original form, and I'd rather people didn't give them money. But those 60 passages and many more were put in to republish because that precedent was overturned a year or two afterwards.
Okay.
Well, and that's an important point to make. So if folks want to support you or read what you actually wrote and not support this pirate publisher, you mentioned the official title is Let's Sell Them a Piece of Blue Sky.
It's a quotation from L Ron Hubbard. On the day that he opened the doors to his first Dianetic Research Foundation, he turned to his friend Don Rogers and he said, "Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky." And he did.
Wow.
In fact,
it's
he sold
eerily
most of
similar
the
to
sky.
let's sell somebody a piece of this bridge, somewhere.
Yes, the Brooklyn Bridge is for sale, I believe, if you've got the money.
And the
I
gullibility.
know a guy who'll sell it to you,
Yeah.
Very much so. And Hubbard's career is fascinating. You've spoken with Tony Ortega, who's a good friend of mine and just an incredibly courageous man. I had no real axe to grind with Scientology when I left. I wasn't upset with anybody. I was just concerned that they weren't telling the truth. And Tony, has that same thing that, this is deceptive and it's harming people. So bless him. I don't think he's made any money doing it. He does have to work for a living as well. But for about 5 years now, he's run this astonishing website, the Underground Bunker, where he reports on Scientology on a daily basis. And he sort of, really dug into some of the things they do. I think my favorite story was he found 2 private detectives who were threatening to sue because they hadn't been paid, their bill hadn't been paid. And for 24 hours, they were able to talk, and then they signed a silence contract because they were paid their money. And what they said was that they'd been following this guy for 24 years on a daily basis, a guy called Pat Broker, because Miscavige, wanted to make sure he didn't do anything. Broker was the guy that Hubbard appointed the head of Scientology in his will. And Miscavige managed to push him aside. So for 24 years, these guys, at a cost of between $10 and $11 million, this guy was followed. I mean, you'll probably be relieved to hear that there was a tax deduction available because it was for religious purposes that he was being followed. What kind of world are we living in, And to finish that story, what David Miscavige found himself with this statement from Hubbard that there were, 23 OT levels, but he only had OT 8. He had none of the others. And he had to watch Broker because he thought Broker probably had them.
It's an amazing rabbit hole, and it just seems like it keeps going down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think Scientology, is going to be a genre, just like science fiction or westerns, because the story is so huge and so crazy. This incredibly narcissistic man who's been a con artist all his life. I mean, as with Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormons, Hubbard had already been found guilty of fraud before he started his practice, check fraud in San Luis Obispo. Mm-hmm. In fact, the fingerprints that were taken from him at that time were the fingerprints that were used to identify his dead body because he happened to die near San Luis Obispo. But here he is. He's a small-time con artist, and in 1948, he goes down and sees his guru, Arthur J. Burks, and many ex-members don't understand that there's this guy before Hubbard. Birx was a major in the US Marine Corps, I think at Paris Island. And he wrote about 800 science fiction stories, and he developed his own idea of spirituality. I don't think he was a dangerous man, but Hubbard had a real thing for him, and he went and visited him in 1948, and he wrote a letter to his literary agent, Forry Ackerman, at this time, which Ackerman let me have, and it's been out in the public for a while, in which Hubbard says that he's developed this new technique, what would later be called Dianetics, and with it, you can rape women without them knowing.
Okay.
Oh my God!
This is what's important, and there are more money-making angles than anything he's ever heard of. He's not saying I found a way of liberating people and freeing them, and he's saying you can do nasty stuff using this.
Well, that's the piece of the blue sky, right?
Yeah,
I know. Every time I think I've heard it all, I haven't, and I probably won't.
No, Jon, this is why these conversations are so fascinating, and we want to thank you so much for being on with us. Again, for folks who are interested, it's an amazing book that's written for the purpose of speaking to Scientologists, but for the general public, it's also incredibly fascinating. Let's sell him a piece of blue sky.
Yeah, and if you want to go to a piece of his website and possibly buy a piece of his artwork, jonatack.com is where some of your non-Scientology, more creative works are.
Mm-hmm. And Jon, how can folks find you? Do you have a social media presence? Is it the website? What's the preference?
The website, as I say, I'm now working with the Open Minds Foundation. My now last but one book was called Opening Minds, and it's an exploration of the basis of all such groups and all such ways of thinking, from radicalized terrorists through to pedophile groomers, through to human traffickers, therapy cults, religious cults, whatever you like. It's a distillation of what I've found out about that, because that's what interests me. Scientology is fascinating, but my main focus, since writing Blue Sky was published in 1990, my main focus has been on normal psychology. I'm very happy to say that we have Philip Zimbardo, we have Robert Cialdini, and we have Anthony Pratt-Karnes, three of the most remarkable psychologists now on our advisory board. So if anybody wants to get in touch with me, if they go to openmindsfoundation.org, and they'll find a contact address there. I'm afraid I'm not doing any recovery work for ex-Scientologists. I'm afraid you'll have to go somewhere else for that, because the demand is too intense, and I was never willing to charge money for doing that. So the 500 or so people I talked with, about, I think, 4 of them gave me some money along the way. So in the end, it just proved to be impossible to live that kind of life, And we want to reach tens of millions of people with basic ideas, so that they will not be so easily lured by these, narcissistic, traumatizing narcissists. And I think that there's a major shift that can happen in society. At the moment we're working on a course on recognizing fake news. That will be free. It will go on the website. From there, we will do a course on human predators and how to recognize these sort of people and not be taken up. From there, we will do a course on the seduction and recruitment techniques used by such people. I touch upon all of these things in my book, Opening Minds. But to get hold of me, openmindsfoundation.org.
Right. And I always say, you're probably, if you're not asking yourself whether or not you're in a bubble, you might be. So go to Open Minds Open Minds Foundation to take a look at that. Awesome, Jon. We really appreciate your time. You're just a wealth of knowledge, and we could talk to you all day. But we'll let you go, and we really appreciate.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. For me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Myth Informed. Myth Informed is brought to you by Mythicist Milwaukee. Producer Sean Frasick, associate producers Fritz Blondon and Kristen Whitaker Hood, engineer Josh Benishek, technical consultant Jason Lawson, and hosts Brian, Dimitri, Jacob, and Joseph. Every week, we produce a new podcast that sheds light on religion, secularism, and mythology. If you enjoy this show, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/mythicist. Mythicist Milwaukee also brings major secular conferences and debates to the Milwaukee area, along with community events, both local and online. To support us in bringing future events, become a member at mythicistmilwaukee.com to receive member-only benefits. You can also visit mythicistmilwaukee.com and hit the donate button located at the bottom of each page to place a financial donation amount of your choice. And now, the closing theme, written and performed by Shelley Siegel.
There was a time when everyone believed Helios in the sun, Poseidon in the sea, Athena's wisdom and beauty, and Hades underneath, Isis of fertility, and ether of the Greeks. They all lie at rest, and who will be the next to die? You know they are all myths, and who will be the next to die? There was a time when everyone believed Helios in the sun, Poseidon in the sea, Athena's wisdom and beauty, and Hades underneath, Isis of fertility, and ether of the Greeks. They all lie at rest, and who will be the next to die? You know they